All right, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for returning with us here. We took a short break, and we are going to continue on in this discussion, moving now into why BAME doesn't work, followed by the language of race, followed by the Instagram post. Okay, so why BAME doesn't work. This is a section out of this report here, the commission, and it's pretty short and pretty sweet. And I think, it can be summarized very easily, but I'd like to just pick out a few points because getting to the heart of definitions that we've already talked about, moving on to the body of knowledge, moving on to understanding the terms and terminology. BAME, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, that's Black, Asian, Middle Eastern?
Minority ethnicities.
Okay, Black, Asian...
minority ethnicities.
Minority ethnicities, so it's only Blacks and Asians, basically.
Yeah. I
Okay.
guess this include like some gypsy.
Right, but so
Eritrean.
minority ethnicities, so that could be anything that it's like the catch-all, right?
Yeah, basically
Right.
everyone with no white.
Right. Okay. So I feel like that is like, wow, it's just there's so much to unpack in it when you think about it, but the idea is it's very all-encompassing, right? And so the only one that obviously is not included in that is what?
Right.
Seemingly, right? Now, I may be incorrect in this, but it seems to me that white people are basic. It's either here's white and then everything else is BAME, right?
Yes, it's
Okay.
it's what.
So it's kind of it's a
mentioned in the report.
dichotomy, is what we'd call that, right? It's a us
Yes.
versus them situation.
Yeah, it's what mentioned in the report is it's the time we dropped the term and talk about people from particular ethnic background, and if we do sometimes need to distinguish.
Between all white and non-white populations.
Yes.
I get that, yeah. So the report saying, look, sometimes we do need to distinguish between all white and non-white populations, but we should use the term, the report says, ethnic minority, ethnic group, or white ethnic minorities where appropriate. Which, makes sense because, look, it's not, just as you say, it's not fair to be lumped up or say that something's a certain way, or, like, it's not fair to always lump white people in the same populace as well. Like, there's a very diverse group of white people. Like me, for instance, what would you guess I am? What would you say?
Alien from Mars.
Okay, what would you say?
I know a bit.
Would you call me? So if you saw me on the street, you'd say I'm white, right? But I'm not. Okay, I'm Native American, and I'm Arabic. I'm between those two. That makes up the majority of what I am: Native American and Arabic. Arabic more, Native American second. Now the color of my skin obviously appears to be light in color, and I appear to be a white Caucasian. But I mean it doesn't accurately describe me or my background or my history.
It's similar to to like Asians as well.
Right.
Like I'm Eastern Asian, but probably many people don't know.
Right.
My family background is Persian.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that. Yeah. Interesting.
My family is Persian descent.
Right.
So
See, I guess the point is like we're not doing each other a service by making a catch-all group of people that are everything other than white and then defining white as just a group of whites. Like that, it just, especially when we talk about disparities or if we're talking about racism, like if you're going to take racism science seriously, then you need to be specific about what it is you're saying and what groups are involved and what disparities exist between those groups.
Yeah, I guess probably later in this little series, it's special. When we are talking about ethnic disparities, we will even see, particularly from the American data, the outcome within the white race, the Caucasian race, there are even difference there.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
So even if you break down people within one monolithic race, you separate them out, you still get disparate outcomes between different people.
I mean,
Asian descent.
You look at the facts, and this report gives the facts says, the British Future has also looked at language of race and whether people felt, as we do, that an aggregate term like BAME has outlived its usefulness. There was no clear majority among either white or ethnic minority respondents for preserving BAME. So what does that mean? That means among the ethnic minorities surveyed, 40% said it was still useful. 36% said it was out of date, and 25 didn't know. I would say maybe those 25 didn't know, or maybe didn't care, or is irrelevant to them. You could also probably look. I would include that in the term that it's outlived its usefulness, and group those two together, because look, if you've got 25% of the people, right, saying, oh, I don't know, or I don't care, then that's not including them, right? So definitely that term is not inclusive enough to matter to those people. So then why don't you focus on something that is inclusive enough to matter, and break it down, be specific. Let's see, any other highlights that you guys pulled out of this? I don't really see too much in this section that's worth really diving too deeply into. I just think that, as far as going deep into the weeds with this term, it's not really getting everybody.
Yes, I guess probably a short summary.
It's a catch-all, right?
Yeah, I guess a short summary is even like we see in the Asian category, there are differences between like Chinese and Pakistani and to Indians.
Right, absolutely, 100%. And so why just do a catch Asian? Everybody's there. If you want to really focus on the disparate outcomes, the only way to do that is to break it down to the categories. And with that said, I think we've done as much as we need to do on that little section. I'd like to move next to the language of race. Now we're going to transition into the language of race, which I think is one of the most important sections of this report. If you were to read absolutely nothing else other than the language of race section in this report, I think you would see a lot of information that's very important. So takeaways from this, we're going to go through it right now. Starting right at the very first sentence, the very intro, the public debate on race is sometimes hampered by the fact that there is no consensus on the meaning of even fundamental words like racism and discrimination. And that's why at the beginning of this podcast, early on, we talked about the definitions.
Yes, I took that part from actually this section of the report.
Right.
Yeah, the reason why is that report at least is showing they are trying to using language consistently. They know what they are talking about.
Continuing on with this report, I wanted to dig down. We talked about that first sentence there, hampered by the fact that there is no consensus. We talked about early on the discussion of the definitions, which are very important. And as we read forward in this paragraph, we see that the report mentions the word racism can apply to such a wide range of human behavior, from the stereotyping of a stranger to the horror of genocide. It is used so differently in debate that people will often argue at cross purposes. And they say that we have sought to examine the practical causes of undesirable disparities, making special note here of what that word is, disparity versus racism, of undesirable disparities between groups, and put forward how to narrow them. However, we have also looked at the way disparities are discussed in mainstream discourse and have been concerned with the use of imprecise and often misleading language around race and racism. And this is important. This is a key sentence, because we're going to be taking an example of exactly what this report is talking about when it comes to this Instagram post that's everyday racism _ okay? They are concerned with the use of imprecise and often misleading language around race and racism. So I think that's pretty clear. What does that say to you? What do you, when you hear that, what's the first thing you think?
It's basically using that word like loosely rather than precise.
Right. So they say that they call it using it too liberally. Yes. But right, yeah, applying it to everything that where there's disparity, whether there's proof or not. And you mentioned this previously, Taz, where you talked about or where we talked about, and I gave the example of my time in CID. Where I did I give the example? Right, CID and the disparity, right, and victims that now are suffering and other victims that are not, and it's unfortunate. They continue on to say the linguistic inflation on racism is confusing, and then they say it is a sad reality that racism still exists in every country. Okay, we're not fighting that. We're not saying that isn't true, but then they go on to say, but we cannot afford for the term to become misunderstood or trivialized. And what does it do when you make claims that are false? It certainly trivializes.
Yeah, that's quite important.
Right.
In my mind, because we know what is racist,
Mm-hmm.
like from the strict.
Right.
Yeah, but what really bothered me is when it's a kind of probably kind of jokey thing, like when the conservatives say racism means a liberal who doesn't have any argument with a conservative, then racism.
Yeah, I mean that's equally as trivializing, like
Yeah.
So I want to just kind of touch on that because I don't want to get too much into politics and I don't want to pick sides, but I have seen an excessive amount of liberals, be they Labor Party here or Democrats in America, use race to their advantage to build their power base,
Yeah.
to utilize and mobilize the unhappiness of people, and use imprecise and often misleading language to motivate that base, right? And how do you do that? Well, you take the primary characteristics or drivers of disparities, or disparate outcomes, and you confuse those or conflate those with secondary characteristics, right? So the point is made often by Candace Owens that the primary drivers or indicators of crime are education, family status, and class. And a lot of people will argue, oh, it's classes, that's blah blah whatever. I have plenty of scientific articles, that you'll find on JSTOR and other places saying that no, there's factual evidence to support that class does play a factor. One of those is by The Myth of Social Class and Criminality Reconsidered, author John Braithwaite. And, he goes on to basically, and we'll show you the study, we'll show you the table. In the American Sociological Review, he goes on to show a table of all these different studies in all these different locations from Philadelphia, Nigeria, England, Scotland, Australia, London, Massachusetts, all these different places, and say, with a sample size of 1,300, 1,200, 200, 400, 975, do lower class adults, is there more criminality there? And in every single case on this, it is yes. Okay, and so Candace Owens talks a lot about this as far as the driving factors being, again, the education, the family status, and the class being obviously the money, the financial whatever. Okay, not just if you have class or not. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about financial wealth specifically, right? Okay, as well as some other socioeconomic factors in there, but those are the primary indicators or characteristics. Okay, the fact that the person is a person of like an African American or a person of color, that is a secondary characteristic. They're saying that is not what's making for this crime. It's just it happens to be that more of these people are disadvantaged, right, for whatever reason, and so that disadvantage is leading to the crime. And so then, of course, the retort by most of the liberals and Democrats, labor is, oh, well, that's because of systemic racism, right? And that's why we're hearing this report, because this report is saying, well, no, that's just not true. There are a load of factors, and in this report has even mentioned, that the systemic racism, we'll get that quote later and put it up on the screen, that systemic racism is virtually non-existent. This report is wanting to say, look, without a doubt, racism exists, and it says that. It is a sad reality that racism still exists in every country, but we cannot afford the term to become misunderstood or trivialized. And we do that when we make what? We make claims without evidence, right? Or we make claims that are partially true and not completely true by leaving out context and information. Let's see. There's a couple of other things I really wanted to poke at in here. The accusations of institutional racism are leveled against institutions. These should, like any other serious accusations, be subject to robust assessment and evidence and show that an institution has treated an ethnic group differently to other groups because of their ethnic identity. What might such evidence look like? And then it goes on to describe what this evidence would look like. we don't need to go into all of the statutes here and really see the recommendations. I advise that you read it because I think that it's important for us to not try to encapsulate one of the most important sections in here in just a couple of sentences and sound bites. What are your thoughts?
Yes. Institutional racism is basically illegal. Not basically, it's completely illegal.
Thank you.
It's not basically.
Yeah.
It
is.
In the UK, we have the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act.
Same with the United States, right? We have all manner of different acts, from the Disability and something Act, I forget, or the Americans with Disability Act, and then there's I'm not good with this, unfortunately, so I'm not going to be able to come up with the name of it, but Equal Opportunity Act, as well as some other things. And so, at an institutional level, it is made illegal in the United States as well.
It's even like a very simple thought experiment.
Right.
So if a company can pay like minority employees lower than, let's say, white employees, then why should these companies hire any white employees at all?
Yeah.
Right.
So if they can save money from that.
Exactly. There are some quotas and things like that which you could argue are forms of racism.
Such as what? Are we referring in this instance to like hiring quotas, or?
Yeah, potentially you could argue. I'm just saying.
I mean, I think you could make the case that we got to be very careful when we say this, because I don't want to disenfranchise people, but I am going to say, when it comes to equal opportunity in America, I think there was a reason and a time and a place for it, because, looking at this report, we see the talk about the progression over 50 years. There's no doubt that 50 years ago, the world was a much different place in the US and in the UK. So certain white people were definitely not happy to share equal opportunity. Okay. So they had to be forced to, right? So they had to have laws to say, look, you must hire XYZ. And now Candace Owens and a few others make the argument that, look, you should hire based on qualifications and levels of exceptionalism, right? Not colors of skin, because that's inherently racist. And I agree, it is now, in my opinion, in this day and age, inherently racist to hire people based on skin color, because you don't have enough representation, so to speak. First of all, who makes the acceptable levels of representation? What are the metrics used there? But second of all, in a free market economy with capitalism, is like, why are you should hire who is the best able. Back in the day, back in the 1950s, I would go as far as to say that, people of color might not have been the best able because of the disadvantages of, slavery and all these other things, so they weren't as well educated. That's fair to say, right? So they wouldn't have been included because they wouldn't have necessarily been the best able, because they wouldn't have had the same opportunities. But as we move forward in time with better opportunities, better education, that level of involvement, or interventionism, as I called it, is less responsible, in my opinion, right? It's less responsible moving forward. And so at a certain point, we need to say, hey, look, is this helping or is this hurting? Do we stick with it or do we get rid of it?
Yeah, especially if we can see that's much more, many times more. Sorry, I forgot how to use the word. That there are so many more generations, more than 3.
Right.
So basically, we can know any generational wealth is very hard to sustain after 3 generations. So we are way past the 3 generations.
I'm not familiar with what is that. Where did that come from?
There are some research about that.
So they're speaking to generational wealth and retaining that generational wealth?
Yes, it's like if I...
And saying that, because, a certain group of people were able to retain generational wealth, it's unfair.
Not group, it's individuals. It's about families. Like, let's say my family is, let's say myself made billions of pounds.
Right.
And I can't exactly remember how many times likely my son or my daughter will retain the wealth. And it's very unlikely my grandchildren will retain the wealth.
I didn't know there was actual studies backing that. So
there are some.
There's some things that look at. So you want to have social mobility, obviously.
Right.
Where people who are qualified and who have the opportunity to be educated can
move
up and down.
Right, which you would not have had without equal opportunity back in the day.
So you want opportunity, but then as Roddy was saying, that it's not something that's always just kept in one place. It's not just like a certain group of people at the top. So
right.
if you if you look at the 1%, that's always changing. The top 1% of income.
Yeah, but again, I don't, this is where we get back into like, is the top 1%, because it's mostly Caucasian or whatever. Like, is that even accurate anymore? Like, I feel like with with China and being pretty much a world superpower, that Jack Ma and all these other people, is like the uber wealthy, I think, are starting to become very equally represented in different cultures, as well as Arabic cultures. I think some of the richest people in the world are Arabic, right?
The cultural monarchy.
Well, I feel like that, even the 1%, and I would have to drill into this, I don't know, but I would feel like even that's pretty well represented. But again, it's stemming mostly, I think, from the opportunities, right? Which is why we want to be focused on the equality of opportunity. As we close the gap on the equality of opportunity, people, it seems, have stopped focusing on that, and now all the hardline protesters, and extreme, actionist people have closed the gap on equal of opportunity and jumped to equality of outcomes.
Yes,
which is like you never stop. Like there's a moment where you reach your goal and you stop, right? Like when you hit the marathon and you hit the finish line, you don't run another marathon, right? And I feel like these activists. Yeah, activist is a word too, but I feel like activist is always kind of, an actionist is someone who just acts on anything, right? Right,
yes.
Just goes, and that's another term for it, activist, right? Like these actionists, these activists, they close the gap and they get to the finish line, marathon done, and they just keep running. And it's like, well, now this isn't fair, and that's not fair.
I guess that's
today's day and age to be born into the most, to be kind of in the elite intelligence more than anything else, as opposed to social class. That's even more beneficial. There's some studies on that.
Yes, I definitely won't go down that rabbit hole for now, because there's a whole topic about intelligence and personality.
Right, and the education portion that's coming up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I think quite simple. When the activists or the hardcore postmodernists, when they find equality of opportunities exhausted, there's no formal barrier at all. But there are still desperate outcomes. Then what the resort is systemic racism theory.
Right.
Or the whole postmodern, what we call critical race theory.
Right.
It's that's why I call it. It's basically a conspiracy.
This report kind of lays it out too. One of the paragraphs I want to quote here is real quick. Is in the last 30 years, attitudes towards racism and hate crimes have changed dramatically, and there is a much greater awareness and willingness to record and monitor such incidents by the authorities. Yet, the advent of social media seems to have partly undermined this apparent march of progress. The spread of mobile phone use and social media in particular has allowed the proliferation of most negative messages and attitudes. And, they say this amplifies the toxic messages of a small number of hardcore racists far beyond any sort of audience that would ever had in the past. And really, that we'll get to that in the police chapter, I think, talk a little bit more about it. But really, it does not only that so that, the actionists and activist groups have something to focus on, but it also allows for the spread of misinformation on their side as well by making claims that taking stats and chopping them down to, a particular set and then saying, look, this is racist. It also allows that message to propagate too. And so it's like you have most of the population that's right here. And then you have these two extreme groups, right, that's going at it, and everybody else is just kind of caught in the middle. And I think that's really what they're trying to do in this report is like, look, calm it down, okay? Take a step back, take a breath, define, understand, research.
I think you need to look at the numbers and data for a lot of things. With the social media thing, I think the key thing is that it's so easy now to put into people's minds, you can show them one image, one video,
right,
that can be viewed a billion times
in different ways.
We're wired in our minds to have a strong empathetical approach to something like that, right? You watch that, you feel a lot of empathy, right?
Right.
So you have a few powerful people who drive a lot of narrative and emotion, because historically, evolutionarily, if you see somebody suffering, you feel for that because you made in tribe, you come from tribes. Whereas if I were to tell you 50 million people have died, there's no emotion to that.
Right.
So people are kind of, I think, biased towards empathy of the images, just like
emotional reactions.
Emotional responses rather than the numbers and the data. So,
and they talk about that here. They say just as racist behavior and racist messages are being amplified, so are accusations of racism that are harder to prove, open to interpretation, or even vexatious. The internet has also exposed the problems inherent in a subjective definition of a racist incident. And then we'll see this because we're about to go to it, and then we're going to close out for this section. In the Instagram post, you'll see this where it talks about, like racist incidents and reports, but then it leaves out data, it leaves out conflicts resolutions, it leaves out so many things, and that's exactly what this report is talking about, saying, hey, look, you are people that are adding to the problem. You're not helping the problem. You're motivating bias, and you're impacting, like racial division, and you're misquoting and you're quoting out of context.
I think you're promoting tribalism is the word.
Well, I mean that,
tribalism,
but
I don't think people should ever.
Yeah, you are, but I don't know that that's necessarily the drive. Like, is that possibly a characteristic of it? Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure that they're not sitting at racism every day, or what is it? Everyday racism, thinking like, I want to promote tribalism. Does that make sense? Like, is it an outcome that it makes more people want to stick together with quote their kind? Perhaps
there's a reason why the postmodern critical race theory kind is very persuasive. It's actually linked to what I'm studying. It's not an empirical starting point,
right?
Like when they're thinking about that, it's not from why, like trying to examine the data first. It's I have some feeling maybe there is something there.
Right. Yeah. So because I feel it this is actually one of the courses I'm working on, and in my study, and one of the courses I'm developing is how feeling plays an important position in knowing, right? Yes. Because with energy information as it comes to you, there is a certain energetic feel. I believe this is my postulate, right? I'm theorizing that certain information, when it comes to you, has an energetic vibration that triggers things within you biologically, right? And that you have a certain knowing of certain types of information, whether it's good, bad, whether it's right, wrong. And I think that a lot of people in situations where different races interact with them, and they feel bad and they feel angry because of the outcome, or they feel negative, that they immediately assign that to some sort of level of racism, as opposed to just a person being an a-hole, right? Like, this person's just a bad person. They don't necessarily need to be a racist to be a bad person.
Yeah.
They're just not nice. They're cruel, they're mean. And, if you were to follow them around throughout their day, you might find that they're mean and cruel and nasty to everyone.
Yeah,
not just you.
Exactly. I think on that point, if you think mathematically, I think it's kind of racist to assume that you're never going to meet a person of another race who's not going to be nice.
Right.
To associate that purely down to your race, that
right.
means, you're going to meet, let's just say 1 in 10 people are going to be unkind to you.
Right.
If you meet another person from another race, and they happen to be that 1 in 10, and you put that down to racism, you're not helping anybody.
Well, and then in your
own group, your own race, who are going to not be nice.
And you said this earlier. It's like, that's a very bad worldview. Like, that's a
people are not nice for a number of reasons.
Right.
I attended one of the meeting. One of the anti-racist.
Did
meeting.
you?
Yeah, I did. I did 3 years ago.
And what did you think?
Basically a meeting.
Anti-racist, was it?
Yeah,
or?
anti-racist.
Okay.
Yeah, right. I have attended one of these like anti-racist meeting organized by a group called Stand Against Racism, I think.
Okay, Stand Against Racism?
Yeah,
okay.
It's basically a professional protest.
How long ago was it?
3 years ago.
3 years? Okay.
Yes. So like what happened?
So this is kind of the height of the
Yes, it's I think it's just within a few months I arrived here, and I found it's quite interesting, at least to know what my opposition is about.
Right. Why do you say the word opposition? I'm curious about that. Like, I'd like to dig into why you just used the word opposition.
I'm not a fan of critical race theory at all.
Right. Okay.
Because it's unscientific. It's a kind of, like, as you mentioned, a ghost hunt
Right. Okay.
kind of theory.
Right. So as history and philosophy science studiers and philosophy science studiers, you have a range of knowledge, from objective and absolute to not and subjective. So not absolute truth and subjective, right? And so everywhere in there, you go from kind of the harder sciences to the softer sciences. This, I would feel, critical race theory, I think, is way on the end.
I won't even say it's a science at all.
Oh, you would not? Okay. So you disagree with the basic tenets of...
Yeah, it's a philosophy in its core.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Let's talk about an example.
Sure.
Talking about.
I think you should, because then we're going to go from there to the Instagram story. So might as well take this detour. It's nice
one of the example they were talking about is people don't sit next to me on the tube. It's a sign of racism.
Right. Yeah, see, now this is where I disagree, right? Like, I don't want to sit next to anybody on the tube, okay? It's the tube, man. I mean, some of them are nice, but most of them are grody. They're nasty. I just don't want to be on any, it's in a closed space. It's like being in an elevator. Like, if you walk into an elevator and there's one person in the elevator, do you go stand right next to them? Or do you stand in the opposite corner?
No, here's the thing with that. You can argue both ways, People are sitting next to you.
If there's 5 urinals in the bathroom and a man is over here, do you go right to the next urinal next to him, or do you go,
That's embarrassing if you do
Sorry, that's not really aimed at the ladies to understand,
or another way.
But the guys get it. Like, yeah, you don't go right to the next... So I think that's a great example of just like imagined racism. It's ghost hunt racism.
Yeah,
like,
it's
how do you feel that is? I just feel that that's why.
Right.
Well, maybe you have 10 cats and people don't like that smell, or maybe they're germaphobes and they just don't want to.
Let's say another thing is when I'm going to church at Westminster, I have to ride basically one stop from Green Park to Westminster. So when there are more people, especially before the lockdowns,
right?
Like it's like there's a seat, like in the middle of the carriage,
right?
Then probably I would just stand. It's
a
1 minute ride.
Absolutely. Like I don't like middle seats either, so I'm avoiding that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about critical race theory. That's the difference between.
Sure, and then we're going to segue into the next.
Yes.
Sure.
Short summary about critical race theory is it's basically a philosophy of all disparities are a result of the power structure. It's founded from Marxism. It has a Marxist foundation. It's basically Marxism just changed.
Right. So the invisible power structure that is there reinforces this, so you can't ever know it or see it or feel it.
Yeah, that's why.
It's like saying that we live in a matrix, but you can't know because the power lies beyond the matrix and you can't interact with. I mean, that is. Yeah, that is the literal definition of vaporous nonsense right there.
Yes, that's why I say it's even not a science at all.
Right,
it's actually plausible. That's another thing.
Right. This is what scientific realists attempted in their day to try and defeat. This is why scientific realism became a thing, is because they wanted to oppose the reification of, quote, vaporous nonsense, that, end quote, that, had no form and no shape and couldn't be tested. It was not falsifiable. It was not testable.
But the main thing is, it's a philosophy, what we do with philosophers.
Right.
We are trying to construct a plausible thought experiment without, appealing to any data. So, this kind of things actually sounds right. Like, we normally believe, at least partially believe, there is different between people. We believe in centralism. There's human nature.
Right.
Things we can't change. Like, when you see a snake, you run away.
Right.
We also believe in nurture.
Right.
Like, probably, David, after you live in London 5-6 years, then you will walk on the left. If you try, probably you drive.
I already do that. I'm actually surprised when people here walk on the wrong side of tube stations. The other thing, I'm like, y'all drive on the left. Why don't you walk on the left? There's so many people that are walking on.
We also should walk on the left as well.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the thing. You just do that. When you do, it's the nurture part.
Yeah,
or
right.
culture.
But see, when I go to a new culture, when I go to a new situation, a new country, I look to see what other people are doing and I follow their lead. I don't see why. I've never understood why you'd want to go to another country and go the opposite direction of the way everybody else is going, unless that country were it was like a very bad country, in which case you're pretty brave for going to a bad country to try and change it. But that's not why people come to the West. They don't come to the UK or the United States because it's bad. They got to fix it. They come because they want to escape bad places. Generally, right? They come for more opportunity. They come for the American dream or to be free or whatever it is. And then instead, it's like they seem to want to go and walk against, go upstream, travel upstream.
My
and I just feel like
is when you do something, like again, then you just accept that as granted.
Right.
So like. These two sounds right.
Right.
So then we have equal opportunity, and we still have an equal outcome. Then there's something there.
Right.
So that's where like the unconscious bias and these things come in.
Right, but see, the unconscious bias is another thing where it's like how do you test unconscious bias? And they're trying to say that certain reactions in the brain to certain images like that test unconscious bias.
That's basically BS.
Right, absolutely, because you can't say that because certain images you react to differently that's the unconscious bias. There may be any number of reasons why you react to that different image differently than someone else, and it doesn't necessarily make you racist, and that's another part of the reification of vaporous nonsense that needs to stop.
They take that as gospel. Like even the founder of the unconscious bias test it's not for that.
I think we should do an entire episode on unconscious bias, honestly.
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of that mentioned in this report, so we're going to try and not drill too much into it.
A short summary about the unconscious bias training, because you brought it up. That test is basically BS.
Yeah.
It's the test and retest consistencies. I think the best I saw is 0.6.
Really?
Yeah. So what it basically means is if I give that test to you, David, you take it today, and then took the result.
Right.
And I gave you the test 2 weeks later,
right.
Because you basically forget what that thing is about.
Right.
And then you take that again and take the result. When I compare these two results,
there's a differentiation of 0.6, so 60%, or is that what?
I can't. I think it's the coefficient.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So let's get that fact checked and put that up on this podcast.
Basically what happened. I also look into like autism screening test. That consistency is like 0.9.
Right.
So as standard is 0.8, at least 0.8.
Right. So anything failing to achieve a 0.8 is
basically BS.
So there you go. I mean, I think we should do an episode on that. What do you think? Should we?
Of course.
Yeah, because I think that's unfair. That's another stab at trying to reify. And what they're doing is they're doing this reductionist, right? They're going piece to piece. Well, if you don't find the ghost here, then you'll find the ghost here. And if you don't find the ghost here, you'll find the ghost here. And if you don't find the ghost there, you've got to find the ghost here. And it's just like, it's never ending, right? Like
especially they go for the obvious.
Right.
They're not trying to actually like what this report
is
going down into the rabbit hole like culture,
right?
Or why like what?
But this report definitely does drill down into each one of those to say, look, we've gone down, and we're gonna, we've gone down as far as you can go, now what, and so now what they're saying is just it's an attack on credibility, ad hominems. Yeah. Oh, they're puppets of the government, and it's like, wow. There's no pleasing some people, but I want to finish this section off by saying, and this is the report I'm quoting here. It says, if we are to build trust in institutions and organizations, we must be willing to investigate evidence of racism. Yes, I agree with that. And be prepared as a society to root it out. This means using all the levers at our disposal. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, of course.
Do you agree with that? The only thing I would add to that...
I'm not too sure that they should... who's using what levels? I don't want big government, so I'm kind of like, I think leaving free markets and...
I think this needs to be. I think this needs involvement at this level like this was done, and I think they need to just go even more hard on this. But I was also add, that if it can't be substantiated in people's claims, and they can't show patterns and proofs and evidence, and they're not willing to do as much work as this commission has done, there ought to be punishment for that. There ought to be accountability for someone like the Instagram post, everyday racism, where they won't allow for comments, right? They turn the comments off, and then they put stuff that is patently false and it's not being fact checked. And I think there ought to be accountability for that situation. That it's doing exactly what this report is talking about.
Right. Should we start talking about the Instagram?
I think we should get to it. I think everybody's like, "What is this Instagram post?"
Yeah, it's like something just hiding there so long.
All right, so now we are moving on to the Instagram post. Now I know a lot of you out there are probably have waited impatiently to get to this Instagram post. You'd be like, this Instagram post keeps mentioning it. What are you talking about? Just get on with it already.
That's the most spicy part.
Right, it is spicy. And I think that there might be some people out here that become offended or triggered. But I want you to know that we are not setting out to trigger you or to offend you, okay? It's our intent to show you, in relation to the report and what we've already talked about, an example in real life and media of how issues are being conflated, okay, and misinformation is being spread, okay, and it may not be purposeful misinformation. I'm not going to talk about their intent or their desire. I don't know their intent or their desire. Maybe they just don't know. I believe it's clear based on these comments that they didn't read the report. But why don't you tell me a little bit about this everyday racism _ post from Instagram and how you came about it?
Well, I found that when I was basically swiping my Instagram in bed, and the same day when that report came out. And when I saw that from someone basically on the left post that on his story.
Right, and they were basically supportive of it? Is that what?
Yeah, basically left wing, like have the basically buy into the critical race theory.
Right, and all these things that this report is talking about is, look, don't do this.
Yes.
And so what this report is talking about, these are the mistakes that this posting is making. And so let's just get into it. This is everyday racism _ on Instagram. And the first slide that they say...
let's say what the title is. It's
sure.
10 reasons the UK is not a model for racial equality.
Right.
And what you can do about it.
Right. And so exactly what this report is saying they're doing. What their report is saying, don't do this. This is exactly what they're doing.
Yes.
And it's ironic because they're trying to defeat this report, but they're doing some of the things that exactly is what this report mentions. And it's like, did you even read the report?
It's basically kind of lazy thinking.
Well, is it lazy thinking, or is it just inaction on actually reading the report? I don't know. And again, I'm not going to try and testify to their intent. But I will say, having read this report and talking to you now and seeing their slides, I feel that they didn't read the report.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about the first one, okay?
And before that, I just want to read the description for that post.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
For Black people and people of color today, has been triggering and exhausting. White folk now is the time to hold those accountable who will use this report as an excuse to gaslight and downplay the very serious issue of racism faced by people in the UK. Keep the conversation going. Keep educating yourself. Keep being proactive. Keep using your privilege to show up for others. Now is the time. Hashtag listen, learn, do the work.
I feel like that is a very... there are some racial overtones in there that I don't like, first and foremost. They talk about people of color and then they call us white folk,
Yeah.
I guess that would include me. I'm a white folk, No,
you're an alien.
I feel like it's racially charged, and I don't want to say that their intent is to be racially charging, but it seems to me that they're indicating using the word privilege and just the assumption that this is going to shut down the discussion. I disagree. I feel like this report did nothing. It did the exact opposite. Like, it opened up discussion. It opened up thoughts in my mind. It opened up, my desire to be a part of solutions for people's, inequity, like real inequity, real disparities that are racially motivated. And so
another part I want to mention is the hashtag.
Sure.
It says listen, learn, and do the work. It's it has the postmodern underlying there.
Explain that.
I'm sounds like a postmodernist, like trying to dig into the language usage, but it's a kind of postmodern strategy. In the ways of knowing in postmodernism, they don't believe in science. They deny the
they it's not that they don't believe in science. Let's be accurate, okay? They believe that science is relative, all right?
Or the science they agree with.
Right, or that, science is whatever you make it, okay? And that there's no objective truth or very little objectivity.
Yes, because they take scientific method and testimonial or anecdotal evidence on the same ground.
Right.
So they don't.
Well, that's social theory, though. And we're not trying to section out postmodernism by any means, but we are trying to say is most social theory and social science uses that technique because anecdotal evidence is all they have, right?
Yes.
Or because it's not like a logical science like math, right? You can't say 2 + 2 = 4.
Let's put it that way. I have medicine A and medicine B, and you have a problem. I'm the doctor. You're asking me like, well, I have this problem. I need some solution.
Right.
And then I'm going to give you some medicine. You can choose. I have medicine A, which is tested, used 30 years, and it works 99%.
Right.
From all of the data collected. And I have medicine B. It's just I heard my friend who have the same problem as you, and he took that, and it appears to work.
Right.
And which one are you going to take?
I mean, I go with the percentage, the figures, 99%, right?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Well, again, but for me, I don't even want to box myself in like that. I want to say that I will look at both cases and I will do my own research and come to my own informed perspective, not an opinion.
Yeah.
Because I know that sharing opinions, it's the lowest level of informational transfer available, right? Sharing opinion is no accountability. Very little fact, probably, usually. An informed perspective, however, you take into account the backstory, you do your own critical analysis.
Let's just put that simply, like, that's all of the information you have.
Then I'm going with the one with the highest probability.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
So
what the postmodernists think is the value of all of the research and tried and tested method is the same words as someone random, just say unexperienced A and B.
Listen, learn, do the work. Mm-hmm. What you can know as being truthful is the fact that when they say between 2019 and 2020 there were 6 stops and searches for every 1,000 white people compared with 54 for every 1,000 black people, what you can say about that is that there's more people to look at. Okay, there's Asian people to look at. There's Arabic people to look at, and so they haven't included that. That's a fact, okay? So we know that it's a fact that they didn't include Arabic people and Asian people in those numbers. Yeah, why? Why?
Because they are stop and search less.
Well, right. Is that why? I mean, I don't know.
That's why.
I would not say that to another person in a not in an argument, but in a debate. I would not say that's the reason why. Because it's hard to know why. I would say what you can say that's fact, and this is another learning point. What's fact is that they didn't include those, and it's also fact that some people seeing this equate the white and the black and the disparity as racism. Yes. And when you leave out those other two groups, you in essence create this dichotomous situation where there's disparity only between white people and black people. When in truth, when you look at this, the full information is when you look at Arabs and Chinese in the outcomes, both of those are not equal. We see that Arabs are 1 per 1,000 and Chinese are 2 per 1,000. So that's respectively 5 and 4 less than whites, than Caucasians. Yes. Yet they've chosen, everyday racism _ has chosen to focus only on what? White people and black people disparity.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair picture?
Because
if you're worried about disparities, the disparity between black people and Chinese is much bigger than it is between white, and in Arabs it's even bigger. But you're not mentioning those groups.
Yeah, that's my speculation, theory, opinion, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Because the narrative of systemic racism or you call like vaporized or
vaporous nonsense is what the
Yeah.
quote is. I'm gonna have to dig that quote up because I've used it enough now that I'm gonna have to go back and quote that when it comes to.
Or what I call this the conspiracy theory. It's
Right.
basically saying white people created the structure. That's the racism without the racist part.
Right.
White people created that structure to maintain the power of white people against all people of color.
Right.
And
okay, but do we think that is actually truthful in a sense? Like, we can agree that that separate but equal clauses in America, were not that was systemic racism. I mean, we can agree that black people not being allowed to have mortgages or not allowed to vote. Like, we can agree that is those are systemic and institutionalized forms of racism.
Yes. That's
right.
That's the part. And then.
So it has existed, is what we're saying. It certainly has existed.
So let me put that in this way, in a pure logic, probably kind of reductionist way. If I say all people of color are disadvantaged by the power structure created by systemic racism, and if this statement is true, if all people of color, like let's just put it in group level, are worse off than white people, then that holds true. But like this instance, it's not true that Chinese and Arab are actually stopped and searched fewer times compared to white people. Then that statement becomes false.
Right.
Yeah, we will see that more.
We're going to talk about that in the policing section as well.
Yeah,
so
also in what behind disparity.
Right. Okay, so let's just keep this conversation going when it comes to this everyday racism underscore. So first we talked about that situation of the 6 stops per 1,000 for whites, the 54 per 1,000 with blacks. I think just to close that out, I want to say one quick thing and then move into the next one. There's a significant lack of context and racial posturing in this post, and it kind of ignores the importance of primary indicators or influences of crime and secondary characteristics. We talked about this earlier. So it's not a good representation of fact, okay? We talked about family status, class, and other socioeconomic or biological factors. This leaves all of that out, okay? So in my opinion, this is my opinion, again, lowest form of informational transfer. My opinion, it seems to be a cherry-picked statement, and the omissions of fact and lack of context bolster the propensity for people to conclude this outcome is based on racism. Okay, that's the key takeaway. The lack of context and the omissions of fact bolster the propensity to influence people to conclude this outcome is based on racism.
Yes,
that's problematic.
I guess later in your when you're talking about policing, we will find there are actually like particularly young black boys.
Right.
Is on the radar for gun crime.
Right, and we're gonna
particularly in London.
Right, and there's all kinds of statistical analysis done that's going to show a lot of things as far as disparate outcomes, but not necessarily systemic or institutional racism in these situations, which is going to be surprising. I think a lot of people are probably going to be initially triggered by this because they've been because they don't want racism to exist. They want to fight it, and I get that. Like we need to do our best to not allow racism or sexism or all of those isms, right? Because it's the moral rule, right? It's the moral law, okay? All those things end up hurting people, right? And so that's what it boils down to. We don't want to hurt people, but we also don't want to be abused by that same end, okay? All right, the next slide we have here is, this is the slide that says 5,000 complaints about alleged racism have been made to police in England and Wales in the past 5 years, but just 153 have been upheld. I think the key to this is that it's in the language, alleged racism, okay? And this goes right back to this report where we have to ask the questions. Okay, were the complaints investigated? If so, were they justified? And by showing this and in the context of everyday racism and how the report, they're saying is not, it's wrong or it's not good. the context there suggests that that this 153 being upheld, that's racist somehow. But it may just as easily be the case, that the report said that the racial disparities are explained, or even maybe they're unexplained, but that they're not necessarily rooted in racism, right? And so that may be a reason why 153 have been upheld out of 5,000 is because maybe, how many of those 4,000 of those some complaints were some woman on a tube saying, people don't sit by me. What?
Yeah.
Right? So
I guess that's a guy thing, or someone face a very mean white person and he believes it's racially charged.
Right, and I'm not saying that is the case of these complaints, but as a former federal agent, I can tell you I have seen some complaints come in my day where it's just like, you're like, wow, that is not, it's either not a case or it's not our purview, or just on its face, it's like,
or it's not really persecuted.
Right, it's not a crime, really so it's not. There's no statute for it. It's not a crime, right? And sometimes, we've opened and shut things like that. So I would say, obviously, out of the 5,000 complaints, I would hope that they were investigated. I believe they were. I'm sure that they were. I'm sure that whoever was in charge of receiving these complaints didn't just say, "Oh, only 153 of these are good, and we're going to agree with that." I'm sure that there's some level of investigation went into it. But to just kind of put this in here with all the context, this is another. It's a misrepresentation of truth. Perhaps 4,800 some people felt, that their racial disparity was racism, and this report specifically says that is not necessarily the case. Just because there are racially disparate outcomes does not make those outcomes rooted in racism. Yeah. So moving on to the next one, I'm not going to go through all these, just so you all are aware. You can check out the link and check it for yourself. I don't have time. I know you don't have time. I'm sure Taz doesn't have time to go to every person on the internet that's putting up bad information and fact check them. It's unfortunate that I don't see Instagram fact checking them. But this next one, according to the group End the Virus of Racism, there has been a 300% increase in hate crimes towards people of East and Southeast Asian heritage since the start of the pandemic. I don't have those numbers, so I'm not sure where they got it. I guess there's an article that this is tied to. They show that at the end, their citations. Again, we talked about that. Most of the citations are, news articles. I don't know how reliable, getting something from the Guardian is.
From a survey or something.
Right. Okay. So that's fine, but this report specifically says that those numbers are anywhere from 24% to 75%. So
we also have to think about who actually perpetrated these crimes.
Right. Yeah. Explain that.
It's
was it Asian, non-Asian? Is that what you're saying? Because
no.
Okay. Because it is technically a hate crime, so I would assume that someone of a different race against someone of a different race.
Yes, at least anecdotally is
right.
I know a few anecdotal evidence in the U.S. These are actually largely perpetrated by black people.
Really? Okay. I don't have any facts on that. I haven't looked it up, but I can tell you when it comes to the police section, we're going to go in detail on who's perpetrating what crimes statistically, okay? Yes. And you're going to be surprised. So you're going to want to come back and see that if nothing else. I encourage you to come back for the other episodes.
Just like a quick mention.
Very quick. Because I don't want to give anything away. I want people to stick with us.
Yeah, 208 survey in San Francisco is suggests I think above 80% of hate crime accusations are committed by black people. 208
people were surveyed, or
no? 200. A survey took place in 2008.
Oh, 2008. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. 2008. That's quite a while ago. 13 years. I feel like if you're not, I feel like this is why, again, under the census data when we talked about earlier, it's like I feel quaky given 10-year-old data.
That's everything I found, and then these are I know quite a lot of anecdotal testimony.
Right. And so I guess if we're going to talk about, your statistic that says black crime on Asians, then people might be like, oh, that's not fair, or whatever. It's like, well, it's also not fair in 2019, 2020. You talked about the white stop and searches, and you only compared white and black. Yeah. When there's a much bigger disparity between black people and, say, Arab people. It's significantly larger.
Yes,
so yeah, I mean, you're not being fair. You're not being fair, and when you're not being fair, you're not helping this situation. And I think that's the whole purpose of this report, is to say, look, don't do this stuff. Okay, just don't do it. So the next one, people of black and South Asian heritage have a far greater risk of dying from COVID, and this is not due to pre-existing health conditions, to what they say. Okay, so as per the report, this is categorically false. Okay, 100% categorically false according to the report.
Yeah, I think
it is due to pre-existing health conditions, as well as, quote, a wide range of interlocking factors, in parentheses, including geography, occupation, deprivation, and pre-existing health conditions, and parentheses,
and vitamin D level.
Huh?
And vitamin D level.
Right. So yeah, and so I think
I don't want to get into that rabbit hole. One sentence, basically, you are getting so many times more vitamin D
from the sun
than me.
Really?
In the same condition, like the walk we had a few days ago, you get so many times more vitamin D compared to me.
How does that compare to black people? Do you know?
They will even get less.
They will even get less.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's not proportional. It's exponential.
Okay. Right. Okay. So here's something I just learned right now. I was not aware of that. I'd love to dig into that and find out what is that, because of the melanin levels and.
Yes. It's
so they need more sun to get more vitamin D. Is that?
Yes. It's basically what happened is people need.
Is there science behind this, or is this just you're winging it?
I did some research into that.
Really?
Yeah. It's basically what happened in the evolution is. Because there are more sun in Africa,
right?
So, to avoid sunburn,
they developed more
melanin,
right? Yeah,
and then, but
that also blocks out the nutrients of the sun.
Yes, because there are more sun, they can get more vitamin D anyway.
Wow!
But when people go into north,
when you come to a place like London, where God, you get sun Norway, like 10 days out of the year, 12 days out of the year,
or Norway,
right?
They even get less. That's why there is less melanin.
Wow, that is.
And then to get more vitamin D.
Okay, so there we go, folks. Here is a situation in which we don't need to turn to racism as being, some level of systemic racism in the medical field, where it's like, this is why, there's different health conditions. But on that note, I want to say, according to their slide, the next thing they say is black women are 4 times more likely to die in mid-pregnancy or in childcare.
It has something to do with obesity.
Right, okay. So this is, again, both of these situations, these are false statements. No fact-checking, but false statements. This is us fact-checking. And I say, well, black women may be 4 times more likely to die mid-pregnancy. This information, it's not put on the slide. You think it has something to do with obesity. I think that...
Or other conditions.
Right. But I don't think that needs to be related to the quality of opportunity of medical care. But it's a known racial disparity, right? It's not necessarily racism; it's a known disparity. But what about this other disparity that works in their benefit? Okay, we do know, according to the report, ethnic minorities do better overall. This is the report speaking. Quote: ethnic minorities do better overall than the white population when it comes to medical issues, and actually have a better outcome for many of the 25 leading causes of death, end quote. Okay, so on that same token, there's many situations where they do better than white people for 25 of the leading causes of death.
Yes.
That comes from the report, okay? They found this information. So why are we focused on this one aspect? Black women are 4 times more likely. You see what I'm trying to lead you to here, okay? And this is the same thing the report is trying to lead you to, is don't take that little, sentence with, 10 some words and think that you can base such an important subject like racism in 10 to 11, 12 words. It doesn't work that way.
Okay.
It doesn't work that way.
The next slide.
So this one I don't have any information on the employment rate of ethnic minority groups. I don't. Did you look into this at all?
No, I guess that's another missing context.
Right. So this is another slide with missing context, and I think as you go through the rest of these, what you're going to see is more continuing lack of context, cherry-picked data, cherry-picked statistics, references from sites that are, politically biased, and article writers, not necessarily doctors. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm going for stats, when I'm going for information about a subject as serious as this is, I'm going to go look at people like Dr. Tony Sewell, okay, and Maggie Adarin Pocock. These are the people that I'm going to be looking to for this information.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the best and the brightest in the room and say, okay, what do you got? Put it together, and then let me read it and read through it.
Yeah, they also have the good evidence. That's
right.
Another very important.
Exceptional evidence. I mean, you go through the report, there's link after link, study after study. So.
Right.
So I think after seeing these first 1, 2, 3, 4 slides here with everyday racism underscore on Instagram, I think we can stop. There's many more slides. I think there's 10 all together. We've done 4. Like I said before, we don't have time to go and fact check everything on the internet, but having read this report and then seeing this post, what do you get the sense of?
It has a big problem of missing context and cherry picking information.
Right.
It's actually play the ball into the court of the report, or particularly even like just for generally well-read people.
Right.
Really well, because that's what the report is criticizing.
Right. It's criticizing this exact behavior right here. And then it's like, okay, did you read the report before you just started pumping out anti-report rhetoric?
I doubt they do, because
I can't imagine you would, because any reasonable person with a moderate level of education can access this report and read it. It's not high-level stuff. Did you find... it
wasn't a scientific journal.
It's not a it's not a scientific journal paper. This is very entry level stuff that you can read. They keep the language very simple, so anyone can read this, and I feel like you should before you make a post about it.
Yeah.
Before you start blatantly attacking its credibility and yeah. So there we are. I think this is going to conclude the first portion of this podcast regarding this commission, this report, and we are going to continue on in the next episode, bringing you some of the breakdown of each section. And in those next sections, what we're going to do is we're going to have everybody be responsible and kind of take you on a deep dive guided tour. Next up, it looks like we will have education. Actually, excuse me. Next up, we will have what lies behind disparity.
Yeah, I will
and
do that yes.
Good co-host Roddy Lau will be taking that.
Yes, and then we will discuss something about Asian supremacy.
Great. And then we're going to be
they are the amazing people in like post like that Instagram post.
Right. Asians and the Arabics were not represented in that as well. In that Instagram post. It was just between white and blacks.
Yeah, the policing one, yes.
Right, and so continuing on, we are going to look then at data, fixing the problem for everyone, education and training. It looks like you are going to be taking that and education, correct? Great, Taz. And then we will be doing employment fairness at work. That will be also you.
Probably I will do the 2 sections.
Right, okay. And then crime and policing, I will be taking a deep dive on. Having been a former federal agent, I think that'll be right up my alley, as well as having wrote a couple of essays about the topic. And then health, I think you and I are both kind of talk about that. Okay, good. So thank you for joining us, everyone. If you liked this podcast, please give us a like, give us a share. Stick with us.
Subscribe.
Like and subscribe. Yeah. And thank you again for joining us. Have a good night. This is David signing off.
And
Roddy and Taz.
Take care.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye for now.
When we talk about the power of melanated people, when we talk about who we really are as guys, and understanding that our melanin is so powerful and it connects us in a way that the reason why they fear black, the reason why they fear is because the lack that they have of it has the lack of pigment, the lack of melanin, that they know that they will be annihilated. So therefore, however they got the power, they have the lack of compassion. That melanin comes with compassion. Melanin comes with soul, that we call it soul. We soul brothers and sisters. That's the melanin that connects us. So the people that don't have it are a little, and I'm gonna say this carefully, are a little less. And where the term actually comes from, because I'm bringing it all the way back around to Minister Farrakhan, to where they may not have the compassion or the when they were sent to the mountains of Caucasus, when they didn't have the power of the sun, that the sun then started to deteriorate them. So then they're acting out of fear. They're acting out of low self-esteem. They're acting out of a deficiency. So therefore, the only way that they can act is evil. The only way they have to rob, steal, rape, kill, and
fight or flight,
in order to survive.
Exactly.
So then these people who didn't have what we had, and when I say we, I speak of the melanated people.
Right.
They had to be savages. They had to be barbaric. Because they're in these Nordic mountains. They're in these rough, torrential environments. So they're acting as animals.
Right.
So they're the ones that are actually closer to animals.